The thing about exhumations is that nobody ever wants to be there. Not the family, not the crew, and certainly not me. But after 20 years in this business, 12 as a homicide detective, 8 as county coroner, I've learned that the dead don't keep secrets. Well, they just keep them longer. It was a Thursday morning in late September when we broke ground on Harold Avery's grave at Meadowbrook Cemetery. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that makes your fingers ache even through latex gloves. I'd been up since 4:30, reviewing the paperwork for what should have been a routine relocation. Harold's widow, Vivian, had remarried and wanted him moved to a family plot across town. Simple enough, the court order was clean, the permits filed correctly. Bernard Keating from Rock Island Funeral Home was supervising the disinterment, same facility that had handled the original burial 7 years prior. Bernard stood beside me now, a tall man with liver-spotted hands, and the kind of face that had seen too many grieving families to waste energy on false comfort. He'd been in the funeral business for 40 years, and I trusted his word on procedure more than most living witnesses. The backhoe operator, a younger guy named Tommy who worked for the cemetery, maneuvered the bucket with surprising delicacy, peeling back layers of earth in careful increments. We'd hit the vault by 6:15. The concrete lid came off 20 minutes later, and that's when I saw Bernard's expression change. He didn't say anything at first, just stared down into the open vault with his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. I moved closer, my boots squelching in the damp soil. The casket was a mid-range bronze model, its surface dulled by years underground but otherwise intact. No visible damage to the seal, no signs of tampering or water intrusion. Everything looked exactly as it should. "Something wrong?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. You don't spend 2 decades reading death without learning to recognize when something's off. Bernard cleared his throat. "Seal looks good, maybe too good. But that's not." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Let's get it topside." We used nylon straps to lift the casket from the vault, the mechanism groaning under the weight. That was the first thing that struck me. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have been for a single body, even accounting for the casket itself. I made a mental note but said nothing. Sometimes your gut knows things before your brain catches up. Once we had the casket on level ground, away from the open grave, I gave Bernard the nod. His hands were steady as he released the locks, 3 on each side, all engaged exactly as they should be. The seal hissed softly as it broke, releasing a pocket of stale air that smelled of old satin and something else. Something floral and chemical at once, like formaldehyde mixed with perfume. Bernard lifted the lid. I heard Vivian gasp behind me. A sharp intake of breath that sounded almost like a scream cut short. Agent Kyle Preston, FBI, assigned to a related missing persons case, stepped forward, his face gone pale beneath his tan. Harold Avery lay in the casket, dressed in the Navy suit we'd documented in the burial records. His body showed the expected decomposition for 7 years underground, the skin leathered and sunken wisps of gray hair still clinging to the skull. But he wasn't alone. Curled against him, fitting into the curve of his body like 2 pieces of a puzzle, was the corpse of a woman. Her dress was pale blue, the fabric still vibrant, despite the years. Her hair, dark and lustrous, fanned across Harold's chest. Their arms were positioned as if embracing fingers interlaced, and the most disturbing part, she looked almost pristine, not fresh, exactly, but preserved in a way that defied natural decomposition, as if she'd been placed there yesterday, not 7 years ago. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think like a coroner, and not a human being confronted with the impossible. "Nobody touch anything," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Bernard, the burial records. Pull them now. Photos, witness signatures, everything." He nodded and hurried toward his van, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. Vivian stood frozen, her new husband's arm around her shoulders, both of them staring at the casket like it contained something holy and terrible at once. Agent Preston crouched beside the casket, careful not to touch. "That's Samantha Greer," he said quietly. "She's been missing 8 years, vanished from Harlow County, no trace. We've had her file active all this time." I knelt beside him, examining the bodies without disturbing them. Both showed signs of ligature strangulation. The hyoid bones fractured, bruising patterns still visible on the throat despite the decomposition. But Harold's death certificate, which I'd reviewed just yesterday, listed cardiac arrest as the cause of death. Natural causes. No autopsy had been performed because there was no reason to suspect foul play. How is this possible? Vivian's voice was small, childlike. I was there. At the funeral. I saw them close the casket. Harold was alone. He was alone. Bernard returned with a thick folder, his hands trembling slightly as he laid out the documentation on a portable table we'd set up for the exhumation. Photographs from the original viewing showed Harold, alone in the casket, exactly as expected. The funeral director's sign-off, the cemetery's intake form, the burial permit, all listed a single decedent. 4 witnesses had signed the burial register, confirming they'd watched the casket lowered into the ground. The vault had been sealed on site, as was standard procedure. There was no possible way for a second body to have been placed inside after burial. I spent the next 6 hours documenting everything. Photographs from every angle, measurements, soil samples from around the vault. The medical examiner's team arrived by noon, and we carefully extracted both bodies for transport and autopsy. Samantha's remains were in such good condition that we were able to run preliminary fingerprint analysis on site. The match was confirmed by 2 p.m. Agent Preston pulled the extended case file that afternoon. Samantha Greer had been 24 when she disappeared 8 years ago. Last seen leaving a restaurant in Harlow County with an unidentified male companion. Her car was found 3 days later, abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. No signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. The case had gone cold within weeks, but Harold Avery's name appeared in the witness interviews. He'd been questioned as a person of interest because his credit card receipts showed he'd been at the same restaurant that night. He claimed not to know Samantha, said it was just a coincidence. He had an alibi for the night she vanished. Dinner with Vivian, their anniversary. She'd confirmed it. The investigators had moved on. Harold died a year later. Heart attack in his sleep. According to the official record, he was 41 years old. No prior cardiac history, but these things happen. Vivian had found him in the morning, called 911, done everything right. The autopsy waiver had been signed because the death seemed natural and the family wanted privacy. Standard procedure. But as I sat in my office that night, going through the files, something nagged at me. I pulled up the county burial database and ran a search for Meadowbrook Cemetery, filtering for deaths in the years following Samantha's disappearance. 3 names jumped out. Michael Torres, 38, died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, according to his certificate. David Charles, 42, died 4 years ago. Accidental drowning. Patrick Sullivan, 35, died 2 years ago. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. I cross-referenced their names with Samantha's case file. All 3 had been interviewed during the initial investigation. All 3 had known Samantha. Torres had been her boss at a marketing firm. Charles was a neighbor. Sullivan was identified by witnesses as someone she dated briefly before she vanished. All 3 were buried at Meadowbrook Cemetery. All 3 in sealed caskets, standard bronze models, handled by Rock Island Funeral Home. I called Agent Preston at 11 p.m. He answered on the second ring, sounding like he'd been waiting for my call. I told him what I'd found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "We need to open those graves," he said finally. "All of them, tonight if possible." We couldn't get the court orders until Friday morning, but by noon we had 3 crews working simultaneously in different sections of the cemetery. Bernard stood with me at the first grave, Michael Torres, his face gray and drawn. He'd reviewed his records twice. Everything was in order. Everything was correct. Single burials, properly documented, properly sealed. Torres's casket was heavier than it should have been. When we opened it, Samantha Greer lay curled against him, her arms around his waist, her head resting on his chest. Same preservation. Same impossible presence. David Charles's grave was the same. Patrick Sullivan's grave was the same. 4 men, 4 graves, 4 identical scenes. Samantha's body in each casket, positioned as if she'd been there from the beginning, preserved in a way that defied every law of decomposition I'd learned in 2 decades of working with the dead. Olivia Hart arrived at the cemetery on Saturday morning. She was Samantha's younger sister, 32 now, and she'd been searching for 8 years. When Agent Preston showed her the evidence, carefully, gently, she didn't cry. She just sat down on the grass, near one of the open graves, and stared at nothing for a long time. She always said they'd be together forever. Olivia said finally. Any guy she dated, if it got serious, she'd say that. We'll be together forever. I thought it was just romantic talk. You know, the kind of thing people say. I knelt beside her. Did she say that to these men specifically? Olivia nodded slowly. I met Harold once, and Patrick. She was so sure about them, so certain, and then she just vanished. And I thought someone had hurt her. I thought she was the victim. The autopsies confirmed what I'd suspected. All four men had been strangled, though their death certificates listed other causes. Samantha's body or bodies, though the DNA confirmed they were all her, showed the same cause of death: strangulation. But the timeline made no sense. She disappeared 8 years ago. Her body couldn't be in 4 places at once, sealed in caskets that had never been opened, preserved in a way that suggested she'd been placed there days, not years ago. Agent Preston pulled phone records, financial statements, everything he could find, and that's when he found it. A fifth name. James Walton, 43. Currently alive and well, living in the same apartment complex where Samantha had lived before she vanished. He'd been interviewed 8 years ago, had admitted to dating her briefly. The relationship had ended badly, according to the reports, but there was no evidence of violence or stalking. He'd been cleared. Last week, James Walton had made an appointment with Rock Island Funeral Home. Pre-planning, they called it. People do it all the time, arrange their own funerals in advance to spare their families the burden. He'd selected a bronze casket, mid-range, standard model, same as the others. He'd specified burial at Meadowbrook Cemetery, Lot 247, Section C. A plot he'd purchased 6 months ago. I'm sitting in my office now, the file open in front of me, and I can't stop thinking about the weight of those caskets. The way Samantha's body looked in each one, pristine, peaceful, positioned like a lover. I keep thinking about what Olivia said, together forever. And I keep wondering, if we went to James Walton's apartment right now, would we find him alive? Would we find him strangled? Or would we find an empty apartment and a receipt for a burial plot? The court has ordered protective custody for Walton, but he's declined, says he doesn't believe in ghosts or curses, that this is all some kind of elaborate hoax. He's going about his life like nothing's wrong, and every time my phone rings, I expect it to be the call. The one that tells me James Walton has been found dead. The one that means we'll be digging another grave. Because I know what we'll find when we do. I know she'll be there, curled against him in the dark, her arms wrapped tight, waiting the way she's always been waiting. In all those sealed caskets, in all those graves, collecting them, one by one. The dead don't keep secrets. They just keep them longer. And Samantha Greer's secret is still unfolding, one burial at a time.
Hello, YouTube family. Thanks for watching. Big love to our subscribers. You keep this channel alive. Only about 20% of viewers are subscribed, so if you enjoy the chills, hit that subscribe button. It's quick, it helps a ton, and it means more stories coming your way. See you in the next one, if you dare.
I need to write this down before I stop being able to tell which thoughts are mine. My name is Brian Keller. I'm the county coroner, and I opened a casket 4 days ago that I should have left sealed. I know how that sounds. But if you're reading this, you need to understand that some bodies shouldn't be disturbed, not because of respect or sanctity, but because death isn't always the end of an argument. My twin brother Richard died when we were 7, drowned in a neighbor's pool while I was inside getting us both popsicles. I found him floating face down, and I remember thinking, before the screaming started, that he looked like a reflection, like the water had turned into a mirror and trapped him on the other side. The funeral home kept the casket closed. My mother said it was better to remember him alive, but I always wondered if there was another reason. If they'd seen something in his face that wasn't quite right. I became a coroner because I wanted to understand death in a way that made sense. Tissue degradation, rigor mortis, livor mortis. These are facts, measurable and predictable. The dead follow rules, or at least they did until Tuesday morning, when Peter Sawyer's attorney filed for exhumation of his wife's remains as part of a wrongful death lawsuit against the vehicle manufacturer. Linda Sawyer had been dead 4 years, buried at Greenfield Cemetery in a standard sealed casket. The paperwork was routine. I'd handled dozens of exhumations. This should have been no different. We broke ground at 6:45 a.m., The light was that thin gray color that makes everything look washed out and temporary. The backhoe operator was careful, took his time with the last few feet of soil. When we lifted the vault lid, I noticed the seal was intact. No water damage, no evidence of disturbance. The casket itself was a mid-grade steel model with a rubber gasket seal. Exactly the kind that should have kept everything contained for decades. But when we hoisted it topside and I released the locks, I smelled something wrong. Not decay exactly. More like the smell of a room that's been closed up too long, where the air has gone stale and thick. Peter Sawyer stood about 20 feet back, his attorney beside him, both of them wearing expressions that said they didn't really want to be there but needed to see this through. I'd read Linda's file the night before. She'd been 38 when she died, driving home from work on a Tuesday evening. Her car veered off Route 47 and struck a utility pole at approximately 60 miles per hour. No skid marks, no evidence of mechanical failure. The investigating officer had noted that witnesses saw her swerve violently, as if avoiding something in the road, but there was nothing there. One witness said Linda looked terrified, staring at something only she could see. When I lifted the casket lid, Peter made a sound I'd never heard from a grown man before, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Linda's body had decomposed the way bodies do when they're sealed in a casket for 4 years. The clothing was intact but discolored. The tissue had withered and dried in places, bloated and liquefied in others. Everything was progressing exactly as expected, except for her face. Her face was perfect. Not fresh. I'm not talking about some miracle preservation, but frozen in a state that shouldn't have been possible given the condition of the rest of her body. The skin was taut and pale, the eyes closed, the mouth slightly open, and she was wearing an expression of absolute shock. The kind of look you see on people who've just witnessed something that breaks their understanding of reality. But that wasn't what made me step back from the casket. It was the second face. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the casket lid. But as I moved, it stayed constant. Beneath Linda's preserved face, slightly offset to the left, was another face. Not a reflection, not an optical illusion, an actual second facial structure visible just under the skin. The nose was displaced about half an inch from Linda's nose. The mouth was wider. The cheekbones sat at a different angle. It looked like someone was trying to push through from inside, wearing Linda's face like a mask. I called Dr. Amanda Sterling at 8:15. She's been the county radiologist for 20 years, and she doesn't rattle easily. But when she arrived an hour later with the portable X-ray unit and saw Linda's face, she went quiet in a way that told me she was seeing exactly what I was seeing. We took films from 6 different angles. Amanda developed them in the morgue's old darkroom because she said she wanted to check them herself before anyone else saw. When she came out 40 minutes later, her hands were shaking slightly. "There are 2 skulls," she said, laying the films on the light board. 2 complete cranial structures, overlapping but distinct. Same bone density, same mineral composition. The teeth, Brian. Both sets of teeth belong to Linda. The dental records match both upper and lower jaws. But the second skull is positioned slightly off-center, like she trailed off, staring at the images, like a reflection. I finished. Peter Sawyer told me about Louise that afternoon. We were sitting in my office, him in the chair across from my desk, me pretending to take notes, but mostly just trying to process what he was saying. Linda had been a twin. Louise had been born second, 14 minutes later, but she never took a breath. The umbilical cord had been wrapped too tightly, cutting off oxygen at some point during labor. The doctors removed her immediately, didn't even let Linda's mother hold her. Peter said Linda had been obsessed with her twin her whole life, always talking about feeling incomplete, like she was missing half of herself. The last few months before the accident, she got worse, Peter said, his voice low and tired. She'd talk about feeling doubled, like she was experiencing everything twice. She'd look in mirrors and say the reflection wasn't quite right, that it was moving a fraction of a second off from her actual movements. I thought it was stress, maybe early onset of something neurological. I tried to get her to see a doctor, but she refused. She said the doctor wouldn't be able to help with what was wrong. He pulled a photo album from his bag, opened it to a page marked with a torn piece of paper. "This is from her 8th birthday. The photograph showed a little girl standing in front of a bathroom mirror smiling at the camera. But in the mirror's reflection, there were 2 faces. The same face, but slightly offset, one overlapping the other like a double exposure. Her mom thought the camera was broken, but it happened in other photos too. Always with mirrors or windows, anything that reflected. I kept the body in the morgue's cold locker overnight. Standard procedure for an exhumation, awaiting further examination. But at 2:30 in the morning, my phone rang. It was the night security guard, an older guy named Tom, who'd worked at the building for 15 years. His voice was tight when he said, "Dr. Keller, I think you need to come down here. I'm hearing voices in the morgue. Two women talking to each other. But there's nobody in there except..." He didn't finish the sentence. I arrived 20 minutes later. Tom was standing in the hallway outside the morgue, refusing to go back in. I could hear it before I even opened the door. Two voices, female, speaking in urgent whispers. The words weren't clear, but the tone was argumentative, like two people fighting over something precious. When I pushed through the door, the voices stopped. The morgue was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Locker 7. That's where we'd placed Linda. I stood in front of it for a long time, my hand on the handle listening. Nothing. But I could feel something wrong in the air. A pressure that made my ears ache when I finally pulled the handle and slid out the tray. Linda's face had changed. The second face was more visible now, pushing through with greater definition. The offset features were clearer. A separate nose, a distinct mouth, and both mouths were slightly open, like they'd been caught mid-sentence. Dr. Sterling ran a facial reconstruction analysis the next morning. She used the X-rays to digitally map the second skull structure and generate a three-dimensional model of what the face would look like. When the image rendered on her computer screen, we both stared at it in silence. It was Linda's face. Exactly Linda's face, but reversed, as if you were looking at her reflection instead of her actual features. Every asymmetry that exists in a human face, the slight droop of one eyelid, the minor deviation of the nose, the way one corner of the mouth sits higher than the other, all of it was flipped, mirror image. Peter came by the morgue that afternoon and told me something that made my blood go cold. The night before Linda's accident, she'd woken him up at 3 in the morning crying. She said she'd dreamed she was looking in a mirror, and her reflection stepped out, stood beside her, and they'd argued about which one was real. Linda told her reflection that she was the one who'd been born, the one who'd lived, and the reflection said, "Not for much longer." Geneva Walsh arrived Thursday evening. She's a spiritual medium who specializes in twin bonds, the kind of person I would have dismissed as a fraud a week ago. But Peter had called her, and I was desperate enough to listen. She sat in my office, a woman in her 60s with gray-streaked hair and calm eyes, and explained it in a way that made terrible sense. Absorbed consciousness, she said. When one twin dies in utero or during birth, sometimes the surviving twin absorbs not just physical tissue but something else. The presence, the awareness, the soul, if you believe in such things. Usually it remains dormant, integrated so completely that the survivor never knows. But Linda knew. She felt Louise her entire life, and Louise was patient. She waited, growing stronger in that shared space until she was ready to claim her own existence. In death? I asked. Geneva nodded. Death is transformation. The body breaks down, yes. But consciousness can reshape flesh if it's determined enough. Linda's death gave Louise the opportunity she'd been waiting for, to finally have her own face, her own form. I haven't slept in 3 days. Every time I close my eyes, I see Richard in that pool, floating face down. And when he turns over in my dreams, he has two faces. I keep thinking about the morning we were born, how the doctor said I'd been the stronger twin, that Richard's heart rate had been slower. I wonder now if it was slow because he was sharing it with me, giving me half his strength so we'd both make it. And I wonder if some part of him has been with me all this time, waiting. The body is still in locker 7. Peter hasn't decided what to do about burial. Dr. Sterling wants to keep running tests, but I know what she'll find. The decomposition has stopped. Not slowed, stopped completely. And the division is accelerating. Yesterday when I checked the locker, the second face was almost fully emerged, distinct from the first. Soon there will be 2 complete bodies in that casket, or what's left of one body that's decided it was never meant to be singular. I can hear them sometimes, even when I'm not in the morgue. 2 voices, one familiar and one not. Having a conversation just below the threshold of understanding. They're not fighting anymore. They're planning. And last night when I looked in my bathroom mirror, I saw Richard standing behind me. Not a ghost, not a memory, him, or the part of him that never left. If you have a twin who died, don't look too closely at your reflection. Don't listen too carefully to the thoughts in your head that don't quite feel like your own. Because maybe they're not. Maybe they never were. And maybe, like Louise, they're just waiting for the right moment to stop being the shadow and become the self. I thought death was the end of identity. I was wrong. Sometimes it's just the beginning of the argument about who gets to keep it. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I cut into Christopher Lane's chest and found something that shouldn't exist. I'm Sarah Fleming, county coroner for the past 8 years, and I've performed over 1,500 autopsies. I've seen bodies pulled from rivers after 3 weeks, burn victims reduced to skeletal fragments, decomposition so advanced the remains were barely recognizable as human. But I'd never seen anything like what was inside Christopher Lane's thoracic cavity. I still see it when I close my eyes at night. Smooth, cold, impossibly heavy. His heart had turned to stone. The exhumation had been ordered on a Friday. Routine paperwork for a life insurance dispute. Christopher had been dead 9 months, buried at Danville Memorial after what his death certificate listed as acute myocardial infarction. He was 47 years old, no prior cardiac history, found dead in his apartment by his brother Keith. The insurance company was contesting the payout because Christopher had taken out a $2 million policy just 6 months before his death, and they suspected suicide or some form of fraud. Keith Lane hired an attorney. The attorney filed for exhumation, and by Monday morning, Christopher's casket was sitting in my morgue waiting for a full autopsy. The morgue smelled like formaldehyde and cold metal that morning, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in that way that makes everything feel slightly unreal. My assistant had already positioned the body on the examination table, photographed the external condition, taken preliminary measurements. Christopher had decomposed normally for 9 months in a sealed casket. The skin had taken on that waxy grayish quality, soft tissue had begun to liquefy in places, but the body was intact enough for a thorough examination. I started with the standard Y incision, scalpel cutting through the sternum, and that's when I felt the resistance. The heart should have been soft, partially decomposed, maybe showing signs of the infarction that supposedly killed him. Instead, when I exposed the pericardial sac and cut through it, I found a solid mass, not tissue, not flesh. Stone. Actual stone, smooth as river rock, cool to the touch, despite being inside a decomposing body. I called Dr. Jordan Wells immediately. He's a cardiologist at County General, someone I trust with the complicated cases, and his voice went quiet when I described what I was seeing. He arrived within the hour. I watched his face as he examined the petrified heart, watched the scientific certainty drain from his expression and get replaced with something I'd never seen in him before. Genuine fear masked as professional fascination. The heart weighed nearly 4 pounds, more than triple the normal weight. The surface was polished smooth, dark gray with veins of lighter mineral running through it like marble. When Jordan tapped it with his fingernail, it rang with a hollow, crystalline sound that echoed through the morgue. "This isn't possible," he said, which is what everyone says when faced with something that clearly is possible, because it's sitting right in front of them. Calcification? Yes. We see that in severe coronary disease. But this is complete petrification. Solid rock. "Sarah, he trailed off, turned the heart over in his gloved hands. "We need to send this for geological analysis." Keith Lane came to my office that afternoon. He was a tall man, early 50s, with the kind of exhaustion in his face that comes from carrying guilt for too long. He'd brought a cardboard box filled with Christopher's personal effects, journals, medical records, therapy session notes. He set the box on my desk and said, "He kept telling us it was happening. He kept saying his heart was turning to stone, and we all thought he was speaking metaphorically. We thought it was the depression talking." I spent that evening reading through Christopher's journals. The entries started 18 months before his death, right after his 7-year-old daughter Emma died in a drowning accident. The early entries were raw with grief, page after page of a father trying to process the impossible fact of his child's death. But around month 3, the tone shifted. He started describing a physical sensation in his chest, a heaviness that grew over time. "I can feel it hardening, he wrote in one entry. Like my heart is protecting itself by turning into something that can't be heard anymore. Something that can't feel. He'd seen 4 different therapists. All of them diagnosed severe depression with possible dissociative features. They prescribed medication, recommended various talk therapy approaches, suggested grief support groups. Christopher tried everything. The medications didn't help. The therapy sessions felt useless. But the grief support group, that's where he found Monica Harper. I found the brochure tucked into one of the journals, Emotional Liberation Through Targeted Calcification Therapy. The language was pseudo-scientific nonsense. Claims about crystallizing traumatic emotional centers and achieving peace through petrification of grief pathways. But Christopher had underlined certain passages in red ink. Freedom from feeling is not numbness. It is transformation. The heart must become stone to survive unbearable loss. Jordan called me on Wednesday with the geological analysis results. His voice was tight, controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to panic. The stone is Devonian limestone, approximately 385 million years old. The mineral composition matches formations found in ancient seabeds. Sarah, this isn't calcified tissue that resembles rock. This is actual Paleozoic-era sedimentary stone. It predates human existence by hundreds of millions of years. I pulled Christopher's death investigation file and started cross-referencing. Monica Harper had been running her grief support group for 23 years, operating out of a converted church basement on the east side of town. No licenses, no credentials, no oversight, just word-of-mouth referrals from desperate people looking for relief from unbearable emotional pain. I called the county health department and asked for records on group members. What I found made my hands shake as I typed. 7 deaths in the past 3 years, all former members of Monica Harper's group, all officially listed as heart attacks. Robert Caldwell, 52. Jennifer Wu, 49. Brian Thompson, 45. David Rodriguez, 51. Angela Foster, 43. Timothy Brennan, 56. And Christopher Lane, 47. I requested exhumation orders for all of them. The county judge, to his credit, signed them without much argument after I showed him the photographs of Christopher's petrified heart. The exhumations took 5 days. We brought each body into the morgue one at a time, performed full autopsies, documented everything with obsessive precision. Every single heart had undergone the same transformation. Stone, ancient stone, impossibly old. But there were differences. Jennifer Wu's heart was the smallest, about 3.5 pounds. Timothy Brennan's was the largest at nearly 5 pounds. And when Jordan arranged them in order by weight, we noticed something that made my stomach turn. They were progressively older. Christopher's heart was 385 million years old. Jennifer's was 390 million. Timothy's was 402 million years old. Whatever was happening was reaching further and further back into geological time. I tracked down Monica Harper's address through property records. She lived in a Victorian house on the edge of town, the kind of place that probably looked charming in daylight but felt predatory in the evening shadows. I brought Keith Lane with me because he had a right to confront the woman who'd done this to his brother. We didn't call ahead, we just knocked on the door and waited. Monica Harper answered wearing a pale blue cardigan and a gentle smile that never reached her eyes. She was 58 years old according to her driver's license, but she moved like someone much older, careful and deliberate. When I told her who I was and why we were there, she didn't seem surprised. She just stepped aside and said, "I suppose you'll want to see the collection." The room was on the 2nd floor, a converted bedroom with built-in shelving along all 4 walls. On each shelf sat a petrified heart, displayed on a velvet cushion like some kind of macabre museum exhibit. There were dozens of them, far more than 7. Some were labeled with names and dates, others had only numbers. Monica walked to the nearest shelf and picked up one of the hearts, cradling it like something precious. "I was the first," she said, her voice soft and almost proud. 20 years ago, after my son died, the grief was eating me alive from the inside out, so I taught myself to stop it, to transform it into something permanent and painless. Stone doesn't hurt, stone doesn't grieve. And once I learned the technique, I felt compelled to share it with others who were suffering. Keith's voice came out strangled. "You killed them. You killed my brother." Monica looked at him with something that might have been sympathy if her eyes weren't so empty. "I liberated them, They came to me begging for relief from unbearable pain, and I gave them exactly what they needed. A heart that could no longer be broken. She set the heart back on its shelf, adjusted it slightly. The transformation takes time, usually 9 to 14 months of regular sessions, but once it begins, it's irreversible. The emotional centers calcify first, then the entire cardiac structure undergoes metamorphosis. Most of them died peacefully in their sleep. When the petrification completed, no pain, no fear, just cessation. I should have called the police then, should have had her arrested immediately, but I was frozen staring at those rows of stone hearts, thinking about the weight of grief and the seductive promise of not having to feel it anymore. My father had died 6 months ago, sudden heart attack at 64. My mother had been devastated, lost in a fog of mourning that nothing seemed to penetrate. And 3 weeks ago, she'd mentioned starting therapy with a grief counselor who came highly recommended. A woman named Monica, who had really helped others process their loss. "Where's my mother?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Monica smiled that empty smile again. "Christine is doing wonderfully. She's been attending sessions for 3 weeks now. We're just beginning the work. She's very committed to the process." I left Keith there and drove straight to my mother's house. It was past 10 p.m. by the time I arrived, every light in the house burning bright. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of cold tea in front of her, staring at nothing. When I said her name, she looked up slowly, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not emptiness, exactly. More like the beginning of absence, like someone slowly fading from a photograph. "Sarah," she said, her voice flat and distant. "I was just thinking about your father. Isn't it strange? I can picture his face, remember his voice, but I can't quite feel it anymore. The grief, it's like it's calcifying, hardening into something I can carry without it crushing me." She pressed her hand to her chest. "I can feel it happening, right here. It's almost a relief." I grabbed her hand, pulled her up from the chair. "You're not going back there, not to those sessions. Not ever." She looked at me with confusion, then a flicker of something that might have been fear. "But I need to go back. Monica says we're making real progress. She says in another few months I won't hurt anymore." I spent that night on my mother's couch, making sure she couldn't leave, making phone calls to lawyers and law enforcement and anyone who might be able to shut down Monica Harper's operation. But the legal process moves slowly, and I'm terrified it won't move fast enough. Because this morning when my mother was in the shower, I found her session notes tucked into her purse. Monica's handwriting, neat and precise. Session 4 of 20, emotional calcification beginning as expected. Heart rate showing characteristics slowing. Estimated completion in 16 weeks. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. Dr. Jordan Wells is publishing a research paper that will probably destroy his career because no one will believe it's real. Keith Lane is filing wrongful death suits that will likely go nowhere because how do you prosecute someone for turning hearts into ancient stone through methods that shouldn't exist? And I'm sitting here looking at my mother's chest rise and fall with each breath, wondering if I'm watching someone I love slowly transform into something that can't be hurt anymore because it can no longer feel anything at all. The worst part is that I understand the appeal. I understand why Christopher Lane and 7 others willingly attended those sessions, why my mother keeps asking when she can go back. Because grief is unbearable. It's a weight that never lessens, never stops crushing you, in the promise of transformation, of transmutation into something permanent and painless. It's seductive in a way that makes me question my own heart. Sometimes I press my hand to my chest and feel the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, and I wonder if it's started yet. If the weight I carry from my father's death is beginning its own slow petrification. If one day I'll cut into my own chest during a routine examination and find stone where flesh should be. Monica Harper is still out there. The police are investigating, but she hasn't been arrested. She's still seeing clients, still promising liberation through calcification. And somewhere in that Victorian house, there's an empty shelf waiting for the next heart to be added to her collection. If your mother or father, or someone you love, starts talking about their grief turning to stone, if they mention a counselor who promises to transform their pain into something permanent, please don't dismiss it as metaphor. Please don't let them attend even one session. Because I've held ancient stone in my hands that used to be human hearts, And I know that some forms of healing are worse than the wounds they claim to cure. The silence in my mother's house tonight is worse than any sound. It's the silence of waiting, of watching for the moment when feeling becomes fossil, when the heart completes its transformation into something that can never break because it can never beat again. I don't believe in magic or curses or supernatural horror. I believe in tissue and bone, in the measurable reality of death. But I've seen 7 hearts that shouldn't exist, held stone that predates human consciousness. And I know that grief can do things to us that science hasn't named yet. Sometimes the real horror isn't dying. It's the lengths we'll go to stop feeling alive. See you in the next one. If your heart is still soft enough to feel fear.